Imagine stepping into the Globe Theatre in London back in 1599. It's packed, the place is noisy, full of people waiting to see the newest play by William Shakespeare, the most famous writer in England. At this time, his name was known across England. He wrote plays, acted in them, and his company even performed for the Queen. Now, fast forward a few hundred years later, we're no longer in this busy theater. Instead, we're in a quiet study, surrounded by books. A scholar leans over a stack of paper and says something strange.
What if Shakespeare didn't really write Shakespeare?
It might sound like a wild idea, but this question has sparked one of the longest-running debates in literary history. Because some people genuinely believe that Shakespeare wasn't the real author behind the works that carry his name. It's an astonishing claim, right? The most famous playwright in history, the supposed author of Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Macbeth, might not have written a single word. It all started when a handful of curious minds refused to accept the legend at face value. But it took a long time for the legend to grow. So why did all the skepticism about Shakespeare surface in the 19th century? Shakespeare's plays weren't always seen as genius. For about 200 years after he died in 1616, people respected his work, but he wasn't treated like some kind of legend. That changed in the 1800s, when people, especially in Victorian England, started seeing him as the greatest writer of all time. You see, around this time, people didn't just see Shakespeare's plays as great stories, they started treating them like the peak of human creativity. Historian Jonathan Bate even said that Shakespeare's work had become the most important body of imaginative literature of the last 1,000 years. But here's the catch. The more people praised Shakespeare, the more scholars started looking closely at his life. And if you're calling someone the greatest mind of the last 1,000 years, of course, people are going to want to know more. But when they started looking into his background, what they found was kind of disappointing. No deep letters, no journals full of big thoughts or about life or art. What they found instead was a quiet businessman whose life seemed really ordinary, even boring. And that gap between Shakespeare's simple, small-town background and the incredibly complex plays he's known for, well, that's what started to make people uneasy. Victorian scholars had a hard time understanding how someone with such a simple background could write plays like Hamlet, with all its psychological prowess, or The Merchant of Venice, with its detailed legal arguments and vast mappings of Italy, or even Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, which show a deep knowledge of ancient history. The doubt started because of a mismatch. People had built Shakespeare up to be such a genius, but when they looked at the real man, a quiet guy from a small town, with no formal education, the son of a glove maker, he didn't seem to fit the legend. So let's break down where most of the skepticism comes from, and it's in these three mysteries. So Shakespeare has a surprisingly humble background. He was born in 1564, the son of a glove-maker, in a small town called Stratford-upon-Avon. There's no record of him going to university, traveling outside of England, or spending time in royal courts. Nothing that connects him to the kind of elite world his plays often describe. Right? Because Shakespeare's plays are full of expert-level knowledge. He writes about royal court etiquette, detailed legal arguments, medical knowledge, military strategies, and detailed descriptions of Italian geography and customs. That's way beyond what someone from a small-town grammar school would normally know. Julius Caesar and Coriolanus show a deep understanding of ancient Roman history and the writings of Plutarch, the Greek philosopher. The Tempest touches on navigation and ideas about colonization, and plays like Othello and The Merchant of Venice include very specific details about Italian life that would make it seem like the author had actually been there. Shakespeare had a family. He got married at 18 to Anne Hathaway, who was 26 and already pregnant. So this might suggest that the marriage was likely rushed, probably to avoid the social faux pas of an unwed pregnancy in that era. And not long after the wedding, Shakespeare moved to London to actually go work in theater. But he moved without his family, and meanwhile, Anne and the three kids, Susanna and the twins Hamlet and Judith, stayed behind in Stratford. He spent most of his career living away from his family. And sure, that may seem reasonable. Honey, I must spread my wings and make a name for myself. I want to become the best playwright the world has ever seen. and so he leaves. But get this, official records show that Shakespeare's daughters could barely write. They only left behind shaky signatures, no letters, no personal writings at all. Now, some will argue that this reflects the gender norms of the Elizabethan era, where educating women was not a priority. But it makes others wonder, would the greatest writer in history really let his own children grow up without learning to read or write properly? I don't know. So let's talk about his travels to London. Maybe it wasn't about him being a genius writer. Maybe Shakespeare's real talent was business. Think about it. He shows up in London wanting to be a part of theater. He knows it's taking off, and he makes some smart moves. By the early 1590s, Shakespeare's name starts appearing in connection with the London theater scene as both an actor and a writer. His early plays, like Henry VI and Titus Andronicus, were popular with audiences, but just because his name was on the script doesn't prove he actually wrote it. Right? Because remember, in this era, authorship wasn't protected the way it is today. Theater companies often bought plays anonymously or attached a known name to draw bigger crowds. So, if someone behind the scenes wanted to stay hidden, like let's say a nobleman, they might have seen Shakespeare as the perfect public face, a working actor already inside the system who could take the credit while the real writer stays invisible. He helped set up key venues like the Globe or Blackfriars and build strong connections with producers, people at court, and wealthy patrons. So with this, it's kind of easy to imagine lesser-known writers or even highly educated noblemen wanting to stay anonymous, handing him scripts, hoping to get staged. Shakespeare becomes the face, the name that sells, maybe not the author, but at least the operator and the brand. And you may be asking, why would a nobleman feel bashful about publishing their work? Well, that's a good question. In Elizabethan England, writing plays was considered low-class work, especially for the stage. Theater was popular entertainment, often associated with rowdy crowds, crime, and moral looseness. Think of it more like today's pop culture or street performances rather than high art. Nobility were expected to pursue higher intellectual or political goals, not write dialogue for actors in makeup to yell on a wooden stage. Things get even trickier with plays like A Yorkshire Tragedy and The London Prodigal. These were performed by the King's Men, Shakespeare's own theater company. So here's the big question, did he actually approve of these being released under his name? The reality is, the King's Men were a business. They staged a lot of plays, and not all of them were Shakespeare's. Sometimes publishers just assumed that if his company performed it, it had to be Shakespeare, and so they printed his name on it. And Shakespeare was still alive then. If it bothered him, why didn't he say something? Maybe he didn't care, or maybe it just wasn't worth the trouble. But one thing was for sure, he was making some money.
I am richer than Croesus. To spend or not to spend, that is the question.
So if that's the case, if Shakespeare was the public face of the plays, not necessarily the author, then it actually makes a lot of sense. It would explain how he gained so much wealth and influence in the theater world, without needing him to have written the literary masterpieces that carry his name. And here's maybe a helpful way to think about it in today's terms. Take the company like A24. They don't write or star in the movies, but when you see their name on a film, you expect a certain level of quality, right? Because over time, their brand became a signal, a mark of creative credibility. So, if Shakespeare's name worked the same way, like a trusted label, it wouldn't matter if every play came from his own pen. What mattered is that his name was associated with something that people wanted to see. In that sense, Shakespeare might not have been just a writer. He could have been the original creative brand, someone whose name guaranteed a good show. So here we are, Shakespeare is making a massive name in the theater world. Okay, let's say just for the sake of argument that Shakespeare did write all those plays, that he worked tirelessly handcrafting every line himself. That brings us to question number 3, the missing paper trail. There's no trace of any of Shakespeare's work. We don't have a single original manuscript in Shakespeare's handwriting. No letters, no drafts, no notes, not even a quick scribble on a piece of scrap paper. And for someone who supposedly spent decades creating some of the greatest works in English language, that kind of silence is hard to ignore. All that survives are 6 signatures, and even those are messy. They're inconsistent and they're hard to read. Trying to prove that Shakespeare personally wrote all these plays, it starts to feel like trying to prove that Bigfoot wrote Hamlet. It's interesting, but almost impossible to prove. But skeptics will say this actually makes sense. If Shakespeare was more of a theater businessman than a writer, maybe he used his name as a brand. He bought scripts from struggling playwrights and never claimed to have written every word himself. But mainstream historians push back. They say it's normal that we don't have original draft. Elizabethan writers didn't usually keep them, and scripts were often thrown out after printing. And this makes sense, but still, skeptics aren't convinced. They ask, if Shakespeare really was the greatest writer in English history, where's the evidence? Where are all the books he owned, the notes he took, the personal thoughts of someone who spent decades creating these amazing plays? Other writers from that time, like Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and Sir Philip Sidney, left behind letters, essays, private writings. So why didn't Shakespeare? And when you put all this together, his simple background, his business success without any personal writing, the missing manuscripts, and not to mention the weird spellings, which we'll get into a little later, it's easy to see why people started questioning things. In fact, some of the most respected thinkers in history began to seriously doubt that Shakespeare was the real author behind the plays. First up, Mark Twain, the famous author of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, known for his wit and love of questioning authority. Twain wasn't just a little suspicious about Shakespeare, he wrote a whole essay about it called, "Is Shakespeare Dead?" He wrote, so as far as anybody actually knows and can prove, Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon never wrote a play in his life. Twain even called Shakespeare's biography an Eiffel Tower of artificialities, meaning it was a huge, impressive-looking structure made of nothing but guesswork. Next, we have Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, and someone who spent his life digging into hidden truths and motives. So it makes sense that he'd be drawn to the mystery around Shakespeare. In 1928, Freud wrote in a letter to his colleague Arnold Zweig. He says, "I no longer believe the actor from Stratford wrote the plays attributed to him. Such genius is too vast and unexplained by his known circumstances." If someone like Freud, who made a career out of uncovering what's hidden, had doubts about Shakespeare, maybe it's worth paying attention. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of America's most respected writers and thinkers, had a hard time with Shakespeare's story. He just couldn't connect the brilliance of the plays with the very ordinary life of the man from Stratford. In 1847, Emerson wrote in his journal, "I cannot marry the works of the life. I am troubled by the ordinary actor of Stratford being Shakespeare." And now, maybe one of the most dramatic quotes of all comes from the famous novelist Henry James. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about the Shakespeare story just didn't add up. In a 1903 letter to writer Violet Hunt, he wrote, "The divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." And these are just a few. There are so many more prominent writers and thinkers who actually believe Shakespeare wasn't the man behind the words. But why do these skeptics matter? Well, because they weren't just some random conspiracy theorists, they were some of the most respected minds in history, people whose ideas shaped culture, literature, and how we even think today. When people started questioning who really wrote Shakespeare's plays, 3 names often come up again and again: Francis Bacon, Edward de Vere of Oxford, and Christopher Marlowe. So let's take a closer look at each of them and lay out the facts and see if any of them might actually hold the key to this centuries-old mystery. First up, Francis Bacon. He was a major thinker of his time. He was deep into philosophy, law, and science, and his knowledge lines up surprisingly well with the topics in Shakespeare's plays. Supporters, known as Baconians, believe he hid secret ciphers and messages in his text to reveal himself. But here's the problem. Bacon was already a very public figure. Why would he need to stay anonymous? And if so, why risk everything by planting secret messages in plays performed in front of thousands? Most historians don't buy it. They see the cipher theories as interesting, but more like speculation than solid evidence. But it's worth noting, many great writers have used pen names. It's not that strange. Here are just a few. For example, we got Mark Twain, George Orwell, Lewis Carroll. The list goes on. But let's get back to Francis Bacon. Now, Delia Bacon was one of the earliest and most passionate supporters of the Bacon theory. Her idea was, well, almost literally groundbreaking. In 1857, she published a book called The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded. And yes, look at that spelling. She spelt it Shakspeare. And let's talk about that for a second. In historical records, Shakespeare's name shows up in a bunch of different forms. Sometimes it's Shakespeare, sometimes it's the normal Shakespeare that we all know, and sometimes, especially in early printed plays, it's hyphenated, Shake-Spear. And can I just side note for a second? I always liked the thought of Shakespeare being like, sort of like Athena with her spear. He was like a writer, a warrior of writings, right? He would shake a spear, his pen, on the paper. Anyways, we can either cut that or leave that in, whatever. Let's get back to Delia and Francis Bacon. No relation. Delia Bacon spelled it Shakespeare on purpose. She believed the real man from Stratford was different from the literary figure Shake-Spear, which she saw as a pen name. But we have to understand a little more about printing practices back then. You see, there wasn't any sort of standardized spelling or formatting practices, not for names, not for titles, not even for everyday words. Printers had a lot of freedom, and they used it. They changed spellings, they would add hyphens, and adjust layouts however they liked, sometimes just to make the text fit better, or appear more aesthetically pleasing on the page. So while some people see Shake-Spear as a clue, maybe even a secret signal, others argue that it was just the product of messy early printing practices. But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. Delia Bacon was a smart, determined historian and lecturer from Ohio, and she became completely obsessed with the question of who really wrote Shakespeare's plays. Delia believed that Shakespeare was just a cover-up, a fake name used by a group of wealthy, educated nobles, and yes, she thought the group might have been led by none other than Francis Bacon himself. Now, why would Delia Bacon think Francis Bacon was actually William Shakespeare? Well, Delia Bacon thought the connection between Francis Bacon and Shakespeare was pretty uncanny, and it actually made a lot of sense. You see, she said the plays shared the same big ideas and worldview found in Bacon's writing. Both men lived in London at the time and even knew some of the same people. And Bacon was known for being smart and clever, much like the person you'd have expected to write those plays. Delia even believed the plays were part of Bacon's big plan to change how people think. You see, Francis Bacon had this big idea called the Great Instauration, and it was his plan to rebuild all human knowledge, from science to philosophy, using logic, observation, and clear thinking, instead of the old traditions and guesswork. Delia Bacon believed Shakespeare's plays weren't just entertainment. They were part of the plan. She thought the plays were designed to get people thinking differently, to challenge old ideas, and push for change. In her view, they were the emotional, creative part of Bacon's mission to transform the world. And if she was right, wouldn't that make the plays a pretty brilliant form of propaganda? In her book, she writes, "Behind the mask of Shakespeare stands not one man, but an entire society of great thinkers and philosophers." So here's something to think about. Whether or not Shakespeare was really Francis Bacon, the plays themselves absolutely challenged the way people thought. Take King Lear, Macbeth, and Julius Caesar. These aren't just stories about kings, they're about how power can twist people, how leaders can fail, and how ambition can destroy everything. And that's a bold thing to show on stage. Or take a look at Hamlet, a character who overthinks everything, questions everything, even life itself.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
Now, that kind of deep inner conflict, that wasn't typical back then. Shakespeare was putting raw human psychology front and center. And then you've got plays like Othello or The Merchant of Venice, tackling race, religion, gender, and justice. Even the women in his plays, Portia, Viola, Lady Macbeth, they're not just love interests or background characters, they are sharp, clever, and they are powerful. Way ahead of their time. So for those who followed Bacon's philosophy, it's easy to see the parallels. These plays don't just entertain, they provoke. They push people to think differently, to question, and to change. Maybe Shakespeare and Bacon influenced each other, or maybe they were never separate to begin with. Now, Delia's ideas were bold, and they were creative. And to most people at the time, they were absolutely, totally Unbelievable. But Delia didn't stop at just writing a book. She wanted proof. She was convinced that important documents were hidden in Shakespeare's tomb. So she traveled all the way to Stratford-upon-Avon, stood at his grave, and actually asked the authorities to open it up. And as you'd expect, the authorities said no, partly out of respect, but also because of the very clear warning carved right into Shakespeare's tombstone. It reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Well, maybe Delia thought the curse wouldn't scare anyone, or that curiosity would win over superstition. Either way, the tomb remained closed, and her theory remained unproven. So what exactly was Delia hoping to find? I think it's simple. Proof. Manuscripts, letters, something in Shakespeare's own tomb that showed he wasn't the true author of the plays, maybe even documents written by Francis Bacon himself. It does sound extreme, but it makes a strange kind of sense, because one of the weirdest parts of this whole mystery is just how little we have in Shakespeare's own handwriting. Even though most people dismissed Delia's ideas at the time, they didn't disappear. In fact, they started to catch on. By the late 1800s, the authorship question had turned into a real movement. Societies were being formed just to figure out who really wrote the plays, and most famously, the Francis Bacon Society, founded in 1886. And shortly after, Ignatius Donnelly, author of The Great Cryptogram, took it even further. He writes, "The plays conceal a ciphered message confirming Francis Bacon as their true author. Shakespeare was merely the pseudonym for Bacon's revolutionary mind." After that, the books started pouring in, each one of them more dramatic than the last. The Bilateral Cipher of Francis Bacon by Elizabeth Wells Gallup in 1900, Is Shakespeare Dead by Mark Twain in 1909, and more recently, Shakespeare Was a Woman, and Other Heresies by Elizabeth Winkler in 2023, just to name a few. And all of them argued, some seriously and some with humor, that Shakespeare wasn't the real author and that hidden writers were behind the famous plays. But one of the most influential books to push the authorship debate in a new direction came in 1920, when an English schoolteacher named J. Thomas Looney published Shakespeare Identified. Unlike the cipher-hunting Baconians, Looney took a different approach. He looked at the plays themselves, their tones, their themes, and values, and asked one simple question: what kind of person could have written this? His answer is our second suspect, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Looney argued that Oxford's life, personality, and background aligned almost perfectly with the works of Shakespeare, and from that point forward, the Oxfordian theory was born. J. Thomas Looney goes on to write, "Edward de Vere's life and works align too perfectly with Shakespeare's writings. Oxford's pen, hidden behind Shakespeare's name, revealed his true life and his profound literary genius." Even Sigmund Freud was convinced. In 1928, he wrote, "I no longer believe Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays. Oxford's biography alone holds the psychological complexity required for Shakespeare's genius." Oxfordians often point to some strange and specific parallels between Edward de Vere's life and Shakespeare's plays. For example, Oxford led a military expedition to Italy, and plays like Othello and The Merchant of Venice show unusually detailed knowledge of Italian cities, customs, and geography. Some even believe Hamlet is partly autobiographical, a story of a nobleman caught in the political power games of a royal court, much like Oxford himself. And one of the most talked about Oxfordian claims centers on the character of Polonius in Hamlet. They argue he's a direct satire of Lord Burghley, who just happened to be Oxford's real-life father-in-law. So listen, in this play, Polonius gives this speech to his son Laertes as he leaves for France. And it's meant to be wise and practical, but in the play, Polonius is often seen as pompous and overly self-important. That's why Oxfordians think Shakespeare may have been poking fun at Lord Burghley, who was known for giving his long-winded moralistic advice just like this: "Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season this in thee." It's an interesting take, and this theory didn't stop here. The Oxford theory even made its way to Hollywood in 2011 The film Anonymous portrayed Edward de Vere as the secret author behind Shakespeare's works. So Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, a nobleman whose life in many ways mirrored the world of Shakespeare's plays. He had the right background, a top-tier education, insider knowledge of court politics, and extensive travels across Europe, especially in Italy, just like the settings in many of the works. But there's one major issue. Oxford died in 1604, and some of Shakespeare's most famous plays like Macbeth and The Tempest were published or performed after that. Supporters of the Oxford theory argue that the plays were actually written earlier and only released later, or that collaborators finished them after his death. But for most historians, that timeline problem is hard to ignore. And while mainstream scholars reject this theory, the Earl of Oxford remains one of the most popular and persistent suspects in this ongoing literary mystery. So finally, we have Christopher Marlowe, one of the most famous playwrights of his time, known for his bold poetic plays like Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine. He was a rising star, and his writing style was powerful, complex, and emotionally intense. Sound familiar, right? But in 1593, at the height of his career, Marlowe died suddenly. Supposedly, he was stabbed to death in a tavern over a bar bill. And this is where the mystery begins. Marlowe's supporters, otherwise known as Marlovians, claims he staged his death to escape political trouble. And then, he kept writing under the name William Shakespeare. And the timing is interesting. Right after Marlowe's supposed death, Shakespeare suddenly appears as a major playwright. Some even point to similarities in writing style between the two. Calvin Hoffman, one of the most vocal supporters of the Marlowe theory, believed Marlowe's fake death and secret life as Shakespeare wasn't just possible, it was obvious. In his 1955 book, The Murder of the Man Who Was Shakespeare, he writes, "Marlowe's fake death and secret life as Shakespeare is not mere theory. It's the only reasonable explanation of Shakespeare's mysterious literary emergence." And those are bold claims, but here's the problem. Marlowe left a lot of what-ifs. It depends on a major conspiracy, and there's no solid historical evidence to prove it actually happened. And the list continues to grow. Here are other wild and not so wild candidates beyond the big three. Queen Elizabeth I, Mary Sidney Herbert, Countess of Pembroke, Roger Manners, Sir Walter Raleigh, and the list goes on. Now, mainstream historians are confident in their case, and they have reason to be. There's strong evidence from Shakespeare's own time that he really did write the plays. People who knew him, fellow actors, writers, and publishers, openly credited him as the author. Official records confirm that he was deeply involved in the theater world, both on stage and as part owner of a company. And what about the missing manuscripts? Historians say that's not unusual. Original drafts from the Elizabethan era rarely survived, so the lack of personal papers doesn't raise red flags for them. But one of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from the First Folio, the first official collection of Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623, just 7 years after his death. Its full title is Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, and it was put together by people who worked very closely with him. In its introduction, Shakespeare's friend Ben Jonson offered a famous tribute, calling him the Swan of Avon. He writes, "He was not of an age, but for all time. Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear." So there we have it. Edward de Vere, Christopher Marlowe, Francis Bacon, Shakespeare himself. Let's lay it all out, side by side, and weigh the case for each contender. What do we really know? What still doesn't add up? And where does the evidence actually point? Francis Bacon brings serious intellectual credibility, but his case depends heavily on hidden codes and secret messages that have never been definitively proven. Edward de Vere's life lines up closely with themes and details in the plays, but he died too early for several key works to make sense in the timeline. And Christopher Marlowe offers a dramatic and fascinating story, but there's no solid evidence that he faked his death or continued writing afterward. And then there's William Shakespeare himself. He has the strongest historical support. People in his own time said he wrote the plays, but there are still real questions. His background was modest, and there are no surviving letters, journals, or drafts from him. So what are we left with? No theory is perfect, each has strong points and big gaps. Could the real answer still be out there, tucked away in a forgotten archive, buried in a dusty library waiting to be uncovered by future research? Maybe. But maybe the mystery remains because no theory, not even the traditional one, answers everything, and maybe that's why it still captivates us. But before we talk about the big question, I want to lay out 3 more questions. Questions that go beyond Shakespeare and speak to something deeper about how we see history, talent, and truth. Does genius require privilege? Can a self-taught actor from a small town really create the greatest works in English language? Or do we only believe in genius when it comes with a noble title and a formal education? Was Shakespeare the rare exception, or does his story challenge our assumptions about class and talent? Some of the earliest doubts about Shakespeare's authorship didn't come from new evidence, they came from discomfort. Discomfort with the idea that a commoner could understand kings and courts so well, that someone without status could write like he belonged amongst nobles. It says as much about us as it does about him. Do we doubt the man, or do we doubt the class he came from? Vincent van Gogh, Michael Faraday, Frederick Douglass, Maya Angelou, none of them had privilege, but each of them reshaped the world. Francis Bacon, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, their genius was nurtured by wealth, education, and power, and history remembers them that way. So, how do we trust historical evidence? Skeptics point to missing letters, journals, and manuscripts, but does that mean that Shakespeare didn't write the plays? Or is it just a normal gap in history, especially from a time when very few personal documents survived? But here's the thing, history's full of gaps, and the further back we go, the more we rely on fragments. And we have more evidence of Shakespeare's life than we do for many other writers of his time. And still, no one questions the authorship of John Webster, Thomas Kidd, or Thomas Middleton. They were all major playwrights, all with huge holes in their biographies. No letters, no personal artifacts, and no handwritten plays. But none of them says, maybe someone else wrote The Duchess of Malfi. So what does the silence mean? To skeptics, it's suspicious, and to historians, it's just typical. We're used to modern authors, tweets, interviews, rough drafts, and the cloud. But in Shakespeare's time, being a writer meant leaving almost nothing behind. So are we missing proof, or are we expecting too much from an era that simply didn't document the private lives of playwrights? And what do you think about creative writing? Does creative writing require first-hand experience? Anti-Stratfordians would say that the plays show too much insider knowledge about law, about politics, foreign cultures, for a commoner to have written them. But does writing always reflect personal experience, or shouldn't a great writer, with books and imagination, create entire worlds beyond their own? Jules Verne, Mary Shelley, George Orwell, none of them lived the futures they imagined, but each of them changed how we see the world. Ernest Hemingway, Maya Angelou, Chinua Achebe, their writing was shaped by the way they lived, every word rooted in experience. One group dreamed it, the other lived it, and both gave us stories that still resonate. Sometimes lived experience makes writing richer, but imagination, that's where the magic lives. The best writers don't just reflect the world, they invent it. They research, observe, and then imagine the rest. So the question isn't what has Shakespeare lived, but perhaps what did he understand, and how brilliantly he brought it to life? Sigmund Freud, Mark Twain, and even U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens all expressed doubts about Shakespeare's authorship. More recently, actor Mark Rylance, former artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe, has been one of the most outspoken modern skeptics, and in 2011, the film Anonymous brought the Oxford theory to Hollywood, portraying Edward de Vere as the hidden author behind Shakespeare's legendary works. But at the heart of all this doubt lies one big question. Could one man really have done it all? Shakespeare's plays uncover an incredible range of human experience. He gives us Hamlet's deeper inner conflict, Falstaff's wild humor, and Prospero's thoughtful farewell, all written with emotional insight that still moves people today. So how did one person master history, law, politics, philosophy, music, and the details of both royal courts and everyday village life? For some, it's easier to believe that more than one person, or maybe a hidden noble with the right background, was behind it all. Shakespeare's brilliance is what keeps the doubt alive. He seems, in some ways, almost too good to be true. So where does this leave us? Most likely with a renowned admiration for the man, not just as a playwright, but as a historical figure whose life continues to spark endless intrigue. Because in the end, the evidence still points in one direction. The man from Stratford really did write the works of Shakespeare, and maybe the most poetic twist of all is the authorship question. This centuries-old mystery might just be Shakespeare's final unwritten play, a story where he is the central character, the suspect, and the legend, in a whodunit with no final curtain. But no matter where you stand on this debate, one thing is absolutely clear. This controversy has kept Shakespeare's work alive in a whole new way. Whether you read them for poetry or search them for secret clues, the plays still captivate, challenge, and inspire. And maybe in the end, the true author of Shakespeare's genius was never just one person. It was, and always will be, the collective imagination of every reader, every actor, and skeptic who's ever engaged in his words. And that, as the bard himself might say, is the stuff that dreams are made of. If you enjoyed this dive into literary mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more stories that challenge what we think we know. Got a theory of your own? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Bye!